you everyone for coming today. We are the Center for Climate Science and Engineering at the University of Toronto, and we host monthly guest lectures. I am Daniela Boden, the CSE manager, and today we are pleased to feature Dr. Deborah Wunsch from the University of Toronto. So before we get started, I would like to go through the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. If you haven't been before here, we are the Center for Climate Science and Engineering, a research and education center within the Civil and Mineral Engineering Department at the University of Toronto, established in 2019. The CSE is made up now of 8 faculty members who conform the executive team and who participate together in an interdisciplinary research at the intersection of engineering and climate science. So Oya Merkan is the center director, and she focuses on structural analysis. Marianne Hatzapolo research focuses on transportation. Paul Kushner looks at climate dynamics. Graham Norville, Professor Emeritus, focuses on health and safety processes in energy and chemical engineering. Daniel Posen looks at life cycle assessment. Karen Smith focuses on atmospheric science. Marianne Tucci focuses on building science. And Sam Markov from University of California, Merced, who focuses on sustainability and resilience. And then me, the CSE manager. So why we work together and what we are trying to do. So within this, some of the key activities going on at the CSE are education around climate science and engineering. There are 2 graduate courses that have been developed and run in UFT, on top of the 8 online learning models that were developed and are available for use in Ontario higher education environments. Then the team also works to do research. So the faculty members are carrying out collaborative research projects at the intersection of the climate science and engineering. And finally, the team works to do outreach events, just like this one, where we invite the public or other university people to come and give a presentation about topics that we feel are aligned with the mandate and vision we have at the center. Our next guest lecturer is Dr. Michael Craig, Assistant Professor of Energy System at the University of Michigan. His presentation will be about advancing climate adaptation in a decarbonizing electric power sector. This event will happen on December 8th at 5 p.m. So keep tuned for more details about the registration. Now, I would like to introduce today's guest lecture speaker. So Dr. Wunsch is an associate professor at the University of Toronto, cross-appointed between the Department of Physics and the School of the Environment. Her research focuses on understanding the carbon cycle through measurements of atmospheric trace gases, using a variety of measurements techniques. As part of her leadership, she is the chair of the Total Carbon Column Observing Network, TCON, an international project that is responsible for ground-truthing greenhouse gases retrievals from satellites, like NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory. So Dr. Deborah, welcome, and we are pleased to hear more about your research. And I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. I should grab the screen from you. Okay, this might take a second. Are you seeing my notes or are you seeing?
Your notes.
Okay, try this again. We tested this out earlier, but then everything changed. So I'm guessing you're going to see my notes again.
I can see your presentation now. Now, yes.
Okay, perfect. It's always slightly different every time. Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here today speaking to you all. I'm going to tell you a lot about measurements today, how we measure the atmosphere, and how we use those measurements for different purposes in terms of understanding the Earth's carbon cycle. So I would be remiss if I didn't first thank all of the people that I collaborate with, including my lab group, collaborators outside of the university, and collaborators around the world, including the TCON partners and the OCO2 science and algorithm teams. So first, I want to talk to you about the measurement systems today and how they relate to the carbon cycle. So I'm going to describe several measurement systems today, and they were all formed to help understand the impact that humans have had in perturbing the natural carbon cycle. So what I mean by the natural carbon cycle is the flow, and I will also use the word flux for the same purposes, of carbon between the terrestrial biosphere, so the trees and the grasses and other vegetation on land, the oceans, and the atmosphere. And by carbon, I'm going to talk about carbon dioxide, CO2, and I will also talk about methane quite a bit, CH4, in this talk. So the natural carbon fluxes are very large. On land, CO2 fluxes are driven by photosynthesis, the process by which plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as they grow, and respiration as they release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere at night and during cold and dark winters. Other land-based fluxes come from wetlands and soils, which also have seasonal variability, and oceans exchange carbon with the atmosphere over longer timescales, on the order of hundreds of years. I'm not going to talk much about oceans, ocean interactions with the atmosphere and the ocean part of the carbon cycle today. So these fluxes are roughly in balance in the natural carbon cycle on an annual scale. So then humans have come along and we've been perturbing the natural carbon cycle by burning fossil fuels through other industrial processes and altering our use of the land. So for example, clear cutting, agriculture, and urbanization. So these perturbations are quite small compared with the total magnitude of the natural carbon fluxes, but because you have this balance on an annual scale of the natural carbon cycle, the human perturbation becomes very important. You basically subtract two large numbers from each other, you get a small net number, and then you're adding a small number to that, and that could be quite significant. So we see the imprint of human activities readily in measurements of atmospheric composition. So this is another way of looking at the problem. So fossil fuels, let me get myself a pointer here. So fossil fuels and industrial processes, we call those sources of CO2, of carbon, account for almost 90%. Fossil fuels and industry accounts for almost 90% of the sources of carbon released to the atmosphere, and the remainder of the sources released to the atmosphere stem from land use change. And there are three places where carbon can end up once it's been released. It can end up in the atmosphere, it can end up in the terrestrial biosphere, and it can end up in the oceans. So those three are called what we call the carbon sinks. Because carbon dioxide and methane as well are both long-lived gases, they build up in the atmosphere over time. Methane has an atmospheric lifetime of about a decade, and carbon dioxide's atmospheric lifetime is much, much longer, maybe 100 years. So I already mentioned that the fluxes from the natural carbon cycle are large, but that on an annual average, the natural carbon cycle is largely in balance. So in this figure from Friedlingstein et al. In 2020, from the carbon budget in 2020, the authors show the human influences and how they are increasing. So in this figure, time begins at 1850 and moves, I don't know if you can see my cursor, it's not showing up on my screen. So it starts in 1850 and goes towards the present around 2020 on this side of the figure. And on the y-axis here, we've got CO2 fluxes. So positive fluxes are emissions, and negative fluxes are the sinks. And the sinks are broken up into ocean in this dark green color, land in the lighter green color, and the atmosphere in the blue color. So fossil fuels and land use change are positive, and these three sinks are negative. The figure nicely illustrates the variability of the problem that I'm talking about here. The sinks provided by the terrestrial biosphere, so this land component in green, vary widely from one year to the next. They bounce up and down all over the place. So if we're interested in assessing the human impacts on the carbon cycle, our measurements of atmospheric carbon must be precise and accurate enough to measure small perturbations on large fluxes with significant interannual variability. And that sort of sets the challenge that we have in measuring these compounds in the atmosphere. So there are other mysteries of the carbon cycle that have yet to be understood. And you might recall from the previous slide that the oceans and terrestrial biosphere, they seem to go down. They sort of somehow keep up with rising emissions. And to describe that concept more quantitatively, we define something called the airborne fraction. And the airborne fraction is defined as the ratio between the atmospheric growth rate, so how much more carbon dioxide has been added to the atmosphere every year, to the total annual emissions. And this airborne fraction, which is plotted here from 1960 to, let's say, 2018, has stayed roughly constant at about a half since measurements began. Essentially, this means that for every 4 molecules of carbon dioxide that enter the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, 2 of the molecules remain in the atmosphere. 1 is absorbed by the oceans and 1 is absorbed by the terrestrial biosphere. That's not precise, but that's sort of the general idea. We don't know exactly why the airborne fraction is a half, and we don't know when that might change or why. So that's one of the main mysteries we have in the carbon cycle right now. But what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus on more today, is another challenge, which is to identify the regional or sub-regional sources and sinks of carbon dioxide and methane. Over the past decade or so, we've made some really significant progress in identifying some of the largest source and sink regions around the world. But we now wish to identify more precisely which facilities or which regions emit how much, why, and how we can stop it. We want to know what the role of the forests will be in the future and what the underlying mechanisms are to cause these changes. What will the role be of fires, drought, or increased greening of land that was previously too cold to support vegetation? This is something that we're quite interested in Canada, of course. And what is the role, finally, that cities play in the carbon cycle? And that's where I'm going to focus much of the latter half of this talk. So to answer these questions, we need high quality atmospheric measurements. At least that's what I'm going to argue to you today. The fluxes of carbon from the terrestrial biosphere and the oceans flow through the atmosphere, making the atmosphere an ideal place to start searching for these answers. The global methane and carbon budgets that I've shown here, so this is the global carbon budget and this is the global methane budget. I don't want you to be able to see these numbers in any great detail, but what I want you to get out of these figures is that most of the fluxes cycle with the atmosphere on various timescales. And because of this nature of the carbon cycle, with small perturbations again on top of large, well-balanced fluxes that vary significantly from year to year, we need long-term measurements, that is multi-decadal time series. And that's going to be crucial to be able to disentangle different sources and sinks from our atmospheric measurements. So furthermore, both carbon dioxide and methane are potent greenhouse gases, and together they are responsible for over 80% of the energy imbalance that's causing our planet to warm. So we've been recording near surface concentrations of carbon dioxide since 1958, when Charles David Keeling at Scripps Institution of Oceanography first began measurements at the top of Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. So this carbon dioxide record that's on the left-hand side here starts in 1958 and goes to the present. I think I downloaded the data about a month ago. And on the y-axis is the carbon dioxide mole fraction in parts per million, or in micromoles of carbon dioxide per mole of air. So the red line you see is the monthly mean values, and it goes up and down over top of the annual mean, which is marked in black. So you can clearly see the influence of the terrestrial biosphere in the seasonal cycle of the red curve. So the curve descends in the northern hemisphere spring when the growing season begins, and after the growing season ends, respiration dominates over photosynthesis, releasing the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And then this the slow increase that you see marked in black here, which is the annual average, shows the buildup of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that's caused from fossil fuel burning and other human activities. So the plot on the right is now the global monthly mean methane concentrations near the surface. So again, time goes from, what is this, like the 1970s to the present. And the y-axis is the methane mole fraction in parts per billion. It's a similar unit to the mole fractions of methane. And again, you have a seasonal cycle that's marked in the red on top of a slower increase that you can see in the black. So you can see the seasonal cycle as well. That's driven by the main chemical sink of methane, which is the hydroxyl radical, and by seasonal emissions from wetlands, for example. And you can see that this is a much less monotonically increasing. This is nice and smooth in CO2 over here, and you have these periods where methane doesn't appear to be increasing at the same rate. For example, in this hiatus period, what we call the hiatus period between 1999 and 2007. And then you can see that in recent years, it appears as though the increases in methane to the atmosphere are accelerating. So far, there's been no scientific consensus that's emerged to explain either this hiatus period or the recent acceleration, though there's been a lot of effort on trying to understand them. So the measurements I just showed you are part of a global in situ network, which forms the gold standard, I would call it, for carbon dioxide and methane. The network comprises surface, tower, aircraft, and high altitude balloon measurements. And the measurements are highly precise and accurate. And so we call these in situ measurements because they are literally in place, which is what in situ means. Air is collected by the instrument, and the concentration of the air that is inside the instrument is measured. So these measurements are very carefully calibrated to the World Meteorological Organization's trace gas standard scale, because you can put a known amount of the gas into these instruments and make sure that the instrument is measuring precisely and accurately. And so these measurements are good to 1/10 of a ppm for CO2 and a couple of ppb for methane. This is spectacularly high accuracy and precision. So this network has established a long-term, multi-decadal and high-quality record and has been extremely valuable for understanding the carbon cycle as well as we do. So this is the map showing the measurements run out of the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration office in the US. And these are the locations of the measurements that are collected in Canada. And there are other institutions around the world, particularly in Japan and other places that have their own measurement networks, but they all work together to make sure they're on the same absolute scale. So in situ networks are limited in their spatial coverage for lots of reasons, but there are some very practical ones like site access and maintenance. If you can't get to it, you can't sample it. So to obtain global coverage, we've often thought and have implemented going to space. So space-based measurements are fundamentally a different quantity from surface or near surface in situ measurements. They have to use remote sensing techniques to measure through the entire atmosphere, and they obtain information, therefore, about surface concentrations, where the sources and sinks are located, but all the way through the rest of the column of the atmosphere as well. So almost all the currently orbiting satellites that measure carbon dioxide and methane do so by measuring reflected sunlight off the Earth's surface. So sunlight comes in, gets absorbed on the way down to the surface, is reflected by the surface, and gets absorbed all the way back out again to the satellite instrument. So essentially, during this absorption, certain wavelengths of light get absorbed by different molecules, and this is defined by the quantum mechanical properties of the molecules and how they interact with photons. And it is essentially the reduction of sunlight that reaches the satellite at the particular wavelengths that CO2 and methane absorb that tells us how much CO2 and methane are in the path between the sun, the surface, and the satellite. So from the current generation of satellite instruments, it's really difficult to distinguish the altitude at which light is being absorbed. So we get information, a single number of information about the total column of the trace gas from the surface up to the top of the atmosphere. So it's quite important, of course, that we can then compare these satellite measurements that are collected around the globe to the surface in situ network that are so well calibrated and understood. That is, the satellite and in situ measurement scales must be the same. If you measure 400 parts per million from a satellite, it should be traceable to a 400 part per million measurement on the surface. So to do this, we need something called a transfer standard, and that role is often filled by the Total Carbon Column Observing Network, which is a ground-based network of remote sensing instruments that sit on the ground. So what we do is, instead of looking at reflected sunlight, we look at direct sunlight. And so we see this path of the sunlight as it passes through the atmosphere. But we use very similar techniques, measurement techniques as the satellites, and we look at the absorption of sunlight by these trace gases in the path between the sun and the surface. So this allows us to be a comparator between the surface in situ measurements, which we can place nearby our instruments, and the satellite instruments that measure the same quantity, this total column. So the TCON is comprised currently of 28 stations worldwide, and it's designed to measure globally consistent, precise, and accurate total column amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, carbon monoxide, and a whole bunch of other things as well. And in recent years, we've added longer wavelength detectors to our systems to be able to measure other really interesting carbon cycle relevant trace gases. So we're expanding the network, and we have a few planned sites that are marked in cyan, these blue points here, here, and here on our map. But there are sort of glaring gaps in our coverage. You know, all of this region, essentially, most of the southern hemisphere is undersampled, I would say, in our network. There are 2 operational TCON stations in Canada. There's one at East Trout Lake in the southern end of the boreal forest in Saskatchewan, in northern Saskatchewan, and at Eureka Nunavut, our highest latitude station in the network. And we're planning to install a 3rd one at the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay in this coming summer, if all goes well. So the objectives of the network are to constrain global fluxes of carbon and improve our understanding of the carbon cycle, and in particular, the role that humans have been playing in perturbing the carbon cycle. So we also provide crucial validation data sets for the currently orbiting satellite programs, and there's several of them. There's Japanese programs like GOSAT and GOSAT-2. NASA's got a couple of satellites up there now, OCO-2 and OCO-3. There's China's TANSAT and TANSAT-2, and Europe's tropospheric monitoring instrument, otherwise known as TROPOMI. We will also support future satellite instruments like NASA's GeoCarb and France's MicroCarb and several other satellites as well. And here's just sort of an array of photographs of where these TCON stations are located to show some of the variety that we cover in terms of topography and climate and land cover types. So this is the instrument in Boreal, Canada. It was a bit of a cloudy day that day. Here's a beautiful picture of the Eureka Nunavut station in the bright red pearl laboratory. And we have urban stations in Paris, France, for example. We have Izania, Tenerife on top of a 2-kilometer high mountain in the middle of the Atlantic, and various other places as well. So this figure shows the time series of the TCON carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. So carbon dioxide in the top panel, carbon monoxide in the middle panel, and methane in the bottom panel that have been recorded since the network's inception in 2004, where we had the first instrument installed at Park Falls, Wisconsin at about 45 degrees north, and then shortly thereafter in Lauder, New Zealand at 45 degrees south. So the y-axis here is latitude, and the x-axis here goes from 2004 to the present. So the warmer colors show higher concentrations of these quantities, these gases, and the bluer colors show the lower concentration. So you can see very clearly in the CO2, there's a slow secular increase over time, goes from the blues to the reds over the period of time we've been measuring. And you can see the seasonal cycle that's occurring in the Northern Hemisphere that's quite strong. In carbon monoxide, you can see that there's a very strong north-south gradient where the much lower carbon monoxide amounts in the Southern Hemisphere than in the Northern Hemisphere, where much of the industrial processes are going on. And then in methane, there's a north-south gradient, but you can also see in the later years this acceleration of methane that we see in the atmosphere. So to make accurate and precise remote sensing measurements of carbon dioxide is really challenging. So traditionally, at least from space, they would have used measurements of carbon dioxide to do other retrievals like temperature retrievals, because they could assume that the carbon dioxide profile in the atmosphere was extremely well known. And so any variability in the carbon dioxide profile must mean that there was a temperature change. We've now flipped that on its head, and we're now using these measurements of carbon dioxide to actually get at carbon dioxide changes. So these really tiny changes that occur over a pretty big background signal. So this is a really challenging thing to do from remote sensing. This is a figure here on the right-hand side that shows on the x-axis, this is modeled carbon dioxide concentration, and on the y-axis is the pressure. So starting at 1,000 hectopascal at the surface and up to the top of the atmosphere at 0 hectopascal. So each line, each colorful line on this figure shows a representative local noon profile of CO2, that is the variation of CO2 as a function of pressure at the East Trout Lake TCON station in Boreal, Canada. So the colors represent the month of the year. And you can see clearly the seasonal cycle in carbon dioxide, with winter months shown in the reds and the blues showing high CO2 near the surface, and the growing season months, so June, July, August, showing lower CO2 near the surface. And the seasonal variability gets smaller as you go up into the atmosphere. So in the total column, which is the mass-weighted profile, has much less seasonal variability than at the surface. So something that just measures in situ near the surface, or even half the atmosphere using a typical aircraft profile, would measure much more seasonal variability than you would measure if you measure the total column. And on top of that, to make things even more challenging, remote sensing retrievals rely on what we call spectroscopic information about the interactions of light and molecules in the atmosphere. And so we need good quantum mechanical models of how light interacts with these molecules. And we also need really good meteorological information about the temperature and pressure and other atmospheric state, humidity at the time of the measurement. We also need to be good technicians and maintain our instruments with excellent optical alignment so that we can make these measurements as well as we can. So despite the challenges that I just listed of measuring the total column, there are some, using remote sensing, there are some scientific advantages to measuring the total column as well. So the profile of carbon dioxide, which I just showed you on the previous slide, is affected by plant photosynthesis, which removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, respiration, which then releases it back into the atmosphere, other emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning, for example. And then the profile is also affected by the vertical transport that can redistribute the carbon from near the surface up higher into the atmosphere, and advection, which is the process of basically blowing the CO2 around the world. So the interplay of these processes causes carbon dioxide profiles to vary diurnally and seasonally. So on the previous slide, I showed you the seasonal variation of carbon dioxide profiles over boreal Canada. So you'd have higher concentrations near the surface in the winter and lower carbon dioxide concentrations near the surface in the summer. And a similar effect can be seen diurnally, which means from day to night, as illustrated in this animation here, which I made using the tower measurements collected by NOAA at Park Falls, Wisconsin in July 2004. So the x-axis here is again the CO2 concentration, and the y-axis is now in altitude in meters. So from the surface up to 400 meters, that's the height of the tower in Wisconsin. So in this, so if you start at local midnight, which is now, you can see that there is a high concentration of CO2 that drops off rapidly with altitude. So overnight, carbon dioxide is respired by the local vegetation, but these emissions are constrained to a very thin layer in the atmosphere near the surface, which is called the planetary boundary layer, and it results in very large concentrations, but located very close to the surface. So as dawn breaks and sunlight becomes available, there are two things that start to happen. First, the carbon dioxide concentrations near the surface drop rapidly because photosynthesis begins and CO2 is taken up by the plants. And second, the height of the boundary layer increases as vertical mixing increases as well. So the boundary layer thickness typically increases until mid-afternoon, let's say around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and can actually extend above the height of the tower, above the 400 meters of the tower. So from these measurements alone, you might infer a large nighttime flux of CO2 to the atmosphere and a modest daytime photosynthetic uptake of CO2 to the, from the atmosphere, but it's in fact the opposite. The total amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere during the day at this time of year and location is significantly larger than the nighttime release of CO2 back into the atmosphere. And you can see that from the seasonal cycle. In the summer, in the growing season, the CO2 overall is much lower than during the winter on an annual scale. So measurements of the total column are insensitive to the boundary layer height because we look at all of the molecules between the surface and the top of the atmosphere. And so the column is actually more directly proportional to the underlying fluxes. So this figure just illustrates the point that I just made, that this is showing the time on the x-axis from 2004 to 2020. And on the y-axis is the CO2, again in parts per million, the CO2 concentration. And in the black points here, I'm showing the surface in situ measurements at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the boundary layer tends to be well developed. And I've overlaid the daily median total column measurements from the TCON station at Park Falls, Wisconsin in these red points here. So what you can see is that the seasonal cycle amplitude is much larger near the surface, as you would expect from the model that I showed you of the seasonal CO2 profile. But the phasing and the long-term increase are quite similar. Okay, so I said that one of the main roles of the TCON is to provide this transfer standard between the calibrated surface measurements and the satellite measurements. So how do we do that? We collect measurements, atmospheric profiles from these calibrated measurements over our TCON station. So we have, so from time to time, there are people who run aircraft campaigns or balloon profiles, and we ask them very nicely if they can go do a missed approach or a spiral over our TCON stations. And what they do is they come in and either just about touch down in a nearby municipal airport and then take off again, or they do these sort of large spirals around the TCON stations, and they measure the vertical profile of the trace gases of interest on top of our instruments. So then what we can do is we can compare these vertical profiles that they measure that I've shown down here. So this is CO2, this is methane, this is N2O and carbon monoxide, and we can compare that to the measurements we make on the ground. And this is what we get when we do that. We've now done this, we're using aircraft and balloon profiles for over 80 times, I think, for CO2, and about 30 times for methane. And we've also done it for CO and N2O, but I'm not showing that here. And what you can see is that, so the x-axis here is the integrated profile of CO2 from the aircraft or balloon profile, and the y-axis is from our ground-based measurement. And you can see that there's a really tight correspondence between the two, but there's an offset from the one-to-one curve. So the one-to-one curve is indicated by this dotted line, and the fit to our measurements is in this dashed line. And you can see this offset, and that's caused by uncertainties in the spectroscopy that we've got for our retrievals. And so what we do is we remove it from our data, and then we can place our CO2 measurements on the same scale as the really well-calibrated in situ measurements. We do something similar for methane and the rest of the trace gases as well. So once we are convinced, or we're confident that the TCON measurements are on the correct scale, we then use the total columns from TCON, which are the same quantities that you measure from the satellites. And you can then start to compare satellite measurements to the TCON measurements and start working on scaling the satellite measurements as well. So we use TCON to transfer the satellite measurements onto the surface in situ scale. So in this figure here, I'm showing the TCON CO2 on the x-axis, and OCO2, one of the satellites that measures carbon dioxide from space, on the y-axis. Each one of these different colors and shapes, markers, indicate a different TCON station around the world, and you can see that the correspondence between the OCO2 satellite measurements and the TCON measurements are quite good. It did not always look this good, of course, but this is after, you know, almost 10 years of effort in trying to put together these different measurements. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about using all of these measurements together to estimate carbon emissions from the Greater Toronto Area. So this graphic that I'm showing here was made by a student in the group, Sabrina Madsen, and she really illustrates the approach that we take to understanding emissions in the city. So we want to evaluate urban emissions from urban activities and also from urban forest carbon sequestration. We use a mobile in situ measurement system that's pulled by bicycle. We use ground-based remote sensing, that we use these iconic white domes. You'll see those in pictures that come later in the talk. And we also use satellite measurements. Okay, so first I want to explain why I'm so interested in cities. So urban areas are a really important source of carbon emissions to the atmosphere. In North America in particular, urban activities produce up to 80% of the carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere. So it's really an important place. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions within cities is important not only for our climate, but also for air quality, since many of the activities that produce greenhouse gases also produce pollutants like carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate matter. So there are also many municipal level climate organizations in place and around the world fighting to reduce emissions. And one in particular is the C40 Cities Network, a global network of mayors trying to reduce emissions in their cities. And Toronto has been a member of the C40 since around 2005. So the figure I have on this slide shows night lights, that is the lights that are visible from space throughout much of North America, not all of it clearly. And these lights are a very good proxy, and we use them as a proxy for emissions locations on a large scale. So where there are lots of lights at night, there tend to be lots of carbon emissions as well. And you can see clearly several familiar cities on the image, such as where we are now in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, and so on. So Toronto, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, which includes the city of Toronto, Durham, York, Peel, Halton, and Hamilton regions, is Canada's most populous metropolitan area that has around 7 million inhabitants, just under 20% of Canadian population. So emissions from the city are typically reported to governments and intergovernmental groups like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change using what we call bottom-up inventories. So these are accounting systems where industries and businesses report their emissions to a group like the Atmospheric Fund that combines the information together in a report. So for a simple example, let's say you're a farmer who cares for dairy cows. You would calculate your methane emissions based on a standard emission factor that's provided to you for each cow, and then you multiply that number by the number of cows in the herd. So these inventories are incredibly useful because they're actionable. If we know what sector and what component the emissions are coming from, we can regulate or apply other means to reduce these emissions. The challenge with the inventories is that unknown emissions are clearly not able to be included. And it's therefore very important to verify and improve inventories using atmospheric measurements. And I would also argue that it's quite important to measure from the atmosphere as well, because an inventory tells you what you think you have, but the atmosphere is really what climate is sensitive to. So existing inventories in the GTA don't break down the emissions by gas, which is also very hard to verify and monitor from atmospheric emissions. We don't measure equivalent CO2 in the atmosphere, we measure CO2 and we measure methane. So the best spatial emissions inventories we have for carbon dioxide in the GTHA are from the work of Dr. Stephanie Pugliese and her colleagues at the University of Toronto and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And her inventory is shown here on the left, with the inset being the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Warmer or redder colors show higher emissions, and bluer or cooler colors show lower emissions. So these detailed emissions focus on the winter time to avoid complications associated with biospheric contributions, especially from plant growth in the growing season. So Toronto has a lot of trees. So to create a CO2 inventory that's valid for the entire year, we need to take this into account, and that's what we're starting to work on now. So recent developments in producing solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence products from satellites, which is basically a waste product from photosynthesis. When plants photosynthesize, they don't use all of the energy coming from the photons that are incident upon them, and some of it is released as a waste photon, a fluorescence photon, and those photons can be detected from space. So we now have this really neat way of detecting photosynthetic activity from space across a region. And this figure here is showing that. So this is the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, or the Greater Toronto area, and the yellower colors show higher photosynthetic activity, and the bluer colors show lower photosynthetic activity. So this is, you can see clearly the green belt around here, and if you zoom in, you can start to see things like the Don River and various other green spaces in the city. And so we're trying to use this kind of measurement to get a handle on how much the forests and other vegetation within the city are removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So for methane, let's pivot to methane. The best inventory we have was developed by a postdoc in my group now, then PhD student Nazreen Pak, and it's called the Facility Level and Area Methane Emissions Inventory, or FLAME GTA. So this inventory includes all the known point and area sources of methane that we know within the city, that was compiled from municipal reports and other scientific studies. So it's this inventory that we use to guide our atmospheric measurements of methane within the city. And as we add measurements and evaluate the emissions, we update the inventory. So this is the previous slide showed all the individual point sources in different sectors. And then when she grids it onto a, I think a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid, this is what you get. Okay. So now that we have these detailed inventories, we can set out to develop an atmospheric monitoring system within the city to identify and quantify point source emissions, observe and monitor city scale emissions, and then place our city's emissions into a more global context. And I'll go through this relatively quickly. But the idea here is that we want to observe all these different sorts of emissions into the city. We're going to do that using mobile sources, mobile measurement schemes to be able to identify individual point sources and characterize those. And then we use remote sensing upwind and downwind of the city to characterize city scale emissions. And then we use the satellites to be able to measure our city in comparison to other cities around the world. So first I'm going to describe our mobile in situ measurements. Since around 2017, we've been collecting mobile data from a bicycle-pulled cargo trailer that contains an in situ multi-gas analyzer. We also collaborate with ECCC, who uses a truck instead of a bicycle. And the analyzer measures methane and CO2 and water vapor. So we design our routes to survey inventoried emitters, and we also try to sample uncatalogued emitters as well. Come on. There we go. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, you can see the full map, and the redder colors are higher methane concentrations and the purpler colors are lower methane concentrations. And on the right, you can see where I think over here now, I'm just about to take this turn. So you can, so the height of this curtain indicates the concentration that we measured at a particular point. So you can see as we go along, things are relatively flat. So now we've turned this corner and I'm zooming out a bit and we're going to move along in this direction. And we'll start to see a really big enhancement right over there. And that is Kingsmill Park, which used to be a dump. And you can see a couple of other large enhancements, a couple near the water. The one that we saw over here is from the Humber River and the wastewater treatment plant there. So we can compile all those measurements together, and we've done that and compiled them over the last few years, and we can generate maps like this one. So this map shows, so in green is where we've measured but haven't seen any enhancements over the background. The yellow, orange, and red squares here, or grid points here, are where we see small, medium, and large enhancements in a persistent way. So you can see that there are a few locations with large enhancements and more widespread small and medium enhancements. We often see enhancements near the lakeshore. And in a paper published by Dr. Ars et al. In 2020, we looked closely at 3 different types of sources. We looked at landfills from these 2 landfills here. We looked at natural gas compressor stations, this location and this location, and we looked at an engineered waterway marked in blue. So these are 3 of these sources, and he used the measurements that we took from the surveys to compute emissions from these sources. He used a Gaussian plume dispersion model and looked at the Keel Valley landfill, which is pictured here shortly before it was closed. It's been closed for a long time, but it's still emitting methane. There are a couple of compressor stations. This is the Maple compressor station, a picture I pulled off the internet. And then the engineered waterway is the Keating Channel, which is basically at the mouth of the Don before it flows into the open lake. It takes a hard right turn into this channel. And what we believe is going on there is that there's a bunch of organic material in the water. The water becomes anoxic because it's not able to mix, and you get significant methane emissions from that. So what we've learned from this essentially is that our inventory seems to be overestimating emissions from the landfills and underestimating the emissions from the compressor stations. And what we learned about the compressor stations, which is pretty interesting, is that we drove by once and we saw a really large enhancement of methane. And then we went around the block and measured again, and it was gone. And so these kinds of non-persistent or transient or episodic types of emissions, our measurement technique of these surveys is not really conducive to this sort of measurement. So it's really hard to know how to scale that up to an annual emission. So we're trying to come up with different techniques for doing that. And then the Keating Channel is a pretty persistent source. It's not at all included in the inventories because it's an engineered waterway, and that there's no one to report on this, but we see that it's a persistent source and something that ought to be included in the inventories. So now that we have a method to assess individual point sources, we need another technique to assess citywide emissions. And this is where the remote sensing comes in, upwind and downwind of the city. Okay, so the idea with our ground-based remote sensing observing system is to place the spectrometers upwind and downwind of the city regardless of the wind direction. So in the previous simplistic slide, I just showed 2 instruments, but in fact we have 5. So we've got a loop of them around the Toronto downtown at 3 U of T campuses, Scarborough downtown and Mississauga. We have an instrument at ECCC's Downsview site, and we just last week installed our 5th instrument at Egbert, which is another ECCC facility and outside of the GTA, to give us some background information. So the longest running instrument is the one downtown at our lab, and you can see the record that we've been collecting since 2017, and the rest of them have come online since then. We had quite a delay in getting some of these installed, basically because we weren't allowed access to our labs during the beginning of the pandemic. But the initial data from these remote sensing spectrometers is quite promising, and it shows that we're able to detect significant enhancements from the city. So we use these enhancements to compare with the inventories and compute emissions. And then more importantly, with this permanent observatory, we'll be able to quantify not just emissions today, but the emission changes over time as new policies come into effect. And so this kind of observing system should be able to provide important feedback on how effective the city's policies are. So we can also use this observatory to validate satellites, just like we do with TCON, but on a smaller scale. And the initial results from that look quite nice, but I won't go through that in any great detail. I want to tell you about some of the other satellite measurements that we're taking first. So we've got several different types of instruments that measure from space over cities around the world. This is an OCO2 stripe, which is basically a small, thin layer of measurements that across the world. If I think of OCO2 measurements, like if you picture a basketball and then the measurements as the Earth, and then the measurements of OCO2 is kind of like wrapping dental floss around it. It's a really thin strip of measurements that sort of fills out around the globe over the period of time. And then you've got measurements from OCO3, which is on the space station. It has this neat mode called a SAM mode, that snapshot area mapping mode, that can look at small areas. And then this is the Tropomi instrument. This is methane in the top here over the city, and NO2 down in the bottom right corner. So what we want to do is we want to look at enhancements over these cities of these various gases and look at how the different gases relate to each other. So this is an example through the LA basin. So you can see the really thin OCO2 track through the basin. The winds are going this way, so you're getting lots of CO2 from the cars and various other things that are emitting into the air here. And you can see that enhancement as a function of latitude here as well. And you can do the same thing for CO from the Tropomi instrument. It measures a lot more area every day. And you can see in red the enhancement of CO over the LA basin. And you can subtract off a background for that as well. And you can get an enhancement of CO. And what we do is we essentially relate the change in CO to the change in CO2 over the city for various different overpasses. And we do the same thing for NO2 and CO2 as well. And the first thing that we did was we looked at these enhancement ratios and we compared them to what is known to exist in LA, which is a very well instrumented city. And our results agree quite nicely with the ground-based infrastructure we have there. So once we're convinced that we've got enhancement ratios, these slopes between CO and CO2 and NO2 and CO2, we can then turn to other cities around the world. And this is what the results look like for 21 cities around the world in different locations in different places. And they were basically selected because we could measure near them from OCO2. And we can perform these same analyses, and then we can turn to the inventories, the global inventories, to be able to evaluate those on city scales. And what we've learned, which is hard to see from this figure, but what we've learned essentially is that the CO inventories appear to be too small for cities around the world. And the CO2 and NO2 inventories seem to be roughly right. And so that's quite an interesting result, and showing that we need to do a little bit more work at figuring out where the CO is coming from, the carbon monoxide is coming from around the world. So I wanted to give a few minutes for questions. So just to summarize, I hope I've convinced you that atmospheric measurements are really key to understanding questions about the carbon cycle and the role of cities in contributing to global carbon emissions. These in situ networks that I talked about at the beginning are a really important part of the suite of atmospheric measurements because they can be calibrated and they're far more precise and accurate than remote sensing measurements can be. And they can also be used to identify point sources within the city. And I would argue that the role of satellites is to obtain this full global coverage and continually make higher quality measurements at smaller and smaller spatial and temporal scales. And the satellites and in situ measurements networks need to be linked through something like a TCON, a ground-based remote sensing network. So in the city of Toronto, we're able to use all of these observing techniques together to monitor carbon emissions. And we hope that these kinds of measurements will help to inform effective emissions reduction policies. There's far more information on the TCON at our website, and you can download our data here. And if you want more information on our GTA observatory, you can go to this webpage. And in fact, when we go out on our bike or truck to ride around the city and collect measurements, you can watch those measurements come in real time and see the progress of the measurements as they're being taken. And with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.